is the second trip to the International Space Station for two of the astronauts on mission STS-117, and the third for the commander, who was on the first crew to ever go on board the station in orbit. This flight is the first shuttle command for Colonel Rick Sturckow of the United States Marine Corps.
I'm from Lakeside, California. It was a pretty small rural town at the time. I didn't actually grow up in town. I grew up at a ranch about 5 miles from town, and we raised turkeys, and we had cattle, and we then later started into sort of a tree farming business. We had a variety of different trees that we sold.
But Rick was into race cars and racing cars.
I got out of high school when I was 16, and I worked for 2 years at International Harvester. I was a truck mechanic, a lube boy, did brake jobs, transmissions, that sort of thing. And I went to college at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo to study mechanical engineering. They had a racing program there with the Society of Automotive Engineers, which is why I wanted to go there. And that's where I did a majority of my racing. And then I also did some stock car racing. I had my own car that I built and drove it on dirt tracks in California.
That's where his life took a big turn, from wheels to wings.
A professor who had been a Marine Corps pilot during the Vietnam War came up to me and said, "You ought to think about joining the Marines and being a pilot." And of course he made it sound very easy, like you just go down to the Marines and they paint your name on the side of an F-18, and it wasn't quite that simple, but things just worked out.
After flight school in 1987, Sturckow was assigned to a fighter squadron in South Carolina for 4 years, a period that included a 7-month deployment to the Western Pacific. In 1990, he completed the Navy Top Gun fighter weapons training and was sent to Bahrain, from where he flew 41 combat missions in Operation Desert Storm. Then it was on to test pilot school, before being picked by NASA in 1994. His first space flight was as the pilot on STS-88, the first ever ISS assembly flight, joining the Unity node to the Zarya control module. He made a second trip in 2001, delivering the Expedition 3 crew to ISS. One crewmate from that flight is with him on this one. Pat Forrester is only recently retired from the job that he set his sights on when he was a young boy, a United States Army officer.
I grew up in a military family. My father had gone to the military academy and was a career officer, and I knew that's what I wanted to do too.
Forrester's family settled in Springfield, Virginia, where he graduated high school. He followed his father's footsteps to West Point, where he earned a bachelor's degree in applied sciences and engineering, then began his career in the infantry and as an airborne ranger.
Early on, I had just been picked up by a helicopter. I'd been a couple days without sleep, picked up in a what we call a PZ, a pickup zone, and was sitting in the helicopter with my feet hanging out, hungry and tired, and I looked up at the pilots, and one of them was eating a little box of chicken. I still remember a little red and white box. And I said, I thought that this is what I wanted to do. That's what I want to do right there.
Forrester graduated from the Army Flight School and was assigned as an instructor pilot.
And it was during my early years of flying that I read an article about our first Army astronaut, which was General Bob Stewart. And I started thinking, wow, you know, you can do this thing that I love, which is being an Army officer. I think that's a really important role, and but also an astronaut. And it probably there is when my thoughts first started figuring out if that was something that I could really do.
He later got a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from the University of Virginia, served as a flight test engineer, and completed the Navy Test Pilot School before being assigned to the Johnson Space Center as an aerospace engineer in 1993. 3 years later, he was selected as an astronaut, and he made 2 spacewalks on his shuttle flight to the International Space Station in 2001. Forrester retired from the Army with the rank of colonel, the same as his father, in 2005. The other veteran spacewalker on the crew is Jim Riley, an Idaho native who grew up in the suburbs around Dallas, Texas. He traces his interest in spaceflight to the day John Glenn orbited Earth in his Mercury capsule. Riley was almost 8 and visiting the dentist.
And the dentist was a big space fan, listened to John's ground passes every time he went by. And after one that lasted about 15 minutes and he had stopped work and I'm just laying there with all this stuff in my mouth, he asked me if I ever thought I'd like to be an astronaut. I thought anything but here.
But he was hooked and made plans to become an astronaut by first becoming a fighter pilot.
Unfortunately, the end of the Vietnam War changed the number of pilots the military needed, so my path got changed a little bit. I went off to become a scientist. I worked as a geologist, worked in the Antarctic, and then went to work in the oil and gas industry for 17 years. But during that period, I never lost that dream of doing what I'm doing today.
Riley was chosen as an astronaut in 1994. In 1998, he flew on the shuttle mission that delivered Andy Thomas to the Mir space station. In 2001, he made 3 spacewalks on the flight that delivered the Quest airlock to ISS, including the first EVA ever from that new module. Riley's spacewalking partner on this mission is first-time flyer Danny Olivas, a California native who grew up in El Paso, Texas.
The thing that I remember most about El Paso was the view at night. And I remember going up on my roof with my father, and we'd set the telescope up and we'd look at the moon. I just remember being awestruck by the fact that you had this, just an enormous amount of space above us.
He got interested in the space program during a family trip to the Johnson Space Center in Houston when he was 7.
And I remember it was a time near the end of the Apollo era, and I remember coming through the Teague Auditorium, which at the time was a museum, and I remember being just awestruck with what human beings had done.
It sparked an interest in science, an interest he maintained through elementary school and into junior high, along with the other natural interests of most teenage boys. He put in his first application to the astronaut corps when he graduated from the University of Texas, El Paso with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering. He worked in private industry while earning his master's in the same field at the University of Houston, and then got his doctorate at Rice University before joining NASA as a researcher at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was selected for the astronaut corps in 1998.
You realize that the room we're sitting in right now to do this interview is the room that used to be the museum.
Yep, I sure do.
Another member of the class of 1998 is Steve Swanson. Born in Syracuse, New York, Swanson's family moved around a bit before settling in the small mountain town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado.
I've always wanted to do kind of exploring. As a kid, I loved to go in the woods and just go off and explore different areas. And heck, if I could have lived 200 years ago, I'd love to have been like with Lewis and Clark and just living in the woods and exploring all sorts of new areas. It would have been great as far as I'm concerned.
But he pursued the 20th century path of higher education, getting a bachelor's in engineering physics from the University of Colorado and a master's of applied science in computer systems from Florida Atlantic University. Then
I was trying to figure out at that point, I really need to get a job. It was time to really go to work, and it just kind of hit me at that moment that, this is a job I'm going to have for, 30, 40 years. At that moment, I started really going through all the possibilities of what I could do and what sounded fun and adventurous, but also though had used your brain a lot. It was challenging in all sorts of aspects, and the one that popped up at that time was the astronaut.
He was soon hired as a systems engineer in the Aircraft Operations Division at NASA's Johnson Space Center. And after earning a Ph.D. in computer science at Texas A&M, he was selected to become an astronaut. The third member of that class making his first flight on STS-117 is Colonel Lee Archambault of the United States Air Force, born in the Chicago area town of Oak Park and raised in nearby Bellwood.
Well, going back to the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, certainly one of the more significant events in my lifetime was the first lunar landing. So I became interested in the space program back then. Bellwood has a real personal attachment to the space program because it's also the home of Eugene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon. So back in the early 60s when Mr. Cernan was in the space program flying Gemini missions and eventually Apollo missions, he was the man in town, and he generated a lot of interest in the space program in our hometown.
Archambault studied aeronautical and astronautical engineering at the University of Illinois, earning bachelor's and master's degrees. Then he joined the Air Force and earned his pilot's wings in 1986. His operational assignments included 6 months in Saudi Arabia, from where he flew 22 combat missions in Operation Desert Storm.